Oh, I have to explain this Yoda thing. There's a lady here this evening who made this beautiful likeness of me, whose neck I would gladly strangle. Here's the background. So when David Pace and Forrest Reinhardt of the Northwest Christian Church staff took me to lunch to interview me for the job of joining the staff, they put on the full court press, hung all kinds of guilt on me. Now, Roy, this is where you're from. The Northwest needs you. You need to get back here, go to work, forget this retirement stuff. I mean, they really put the full court press on, and they persuaded me. So I said that toward the end of the interview, so what will my title be? And Forrest said, well, we're considering either Gandalf or Yoda. So I told my wife, and she said, oh, well, Yoda, you look like Yoda. And that's the background of it. I've had to live with it for 2 years. In case you're wondering why I'm leaving for Missouri, it's the way I've been treated on that staff. Actually, I've been treated so wonderfully by that staff, by you all. Thank you so much for coming and letting me have this time with you. It's just been a blessing. Well, in this sermon, we'll dive a little deeper into the issues of marriage and family from Ephesians chapter 5 and 6. I begin a place of inspiration where I've gotten a lot of my deep theological insights. Dennis the Menace was a popular cartoon when I was young. And in one of those cartoons, Dennis is visiting next door, visiting the Wilsons. Mrs. Wilson serves him, not unexpectedly, some cake and milk. Mr. Wilson's trying to read his paper. Mrs. Wilson's in the kitchen doing the dishes. Dennis wonders why Mr. Wilson never goes to work. Mr. Wilson explains, it's because he's retired. Retired, asked Dennis. Is that why you loaf all the time? Mr. Wilson tells Dennis that he's earned the right to loaf, since he worked hard for many years so that he could take it easy one day. That makes Dennis wonder why Mrs. Wilson doesn't retire. He's never seen her loaf. Well, she can't retire, Mr. Wilson said, because she's never worked. Well, Dennis can't accept this answer since Mrs. Wilson is always cooking or washing or sewing or something. That's different, Mr. Wilson exclaims. She's a housewife. If she retired, who'd do the housework? Dennis wonders, couldn't you help? Mr. Wilson says, Dennis, are you trying to make trouble? At this point, Mrs. Wilson intervenes, telling her husband not to yell at the boy. He's right and you know it. In the next frame, Dennis is walking up to his mother in her garden. And she asks him what the Wilsons are arguing about over there. And he says, I don't know. I came home because I didn't want to get involved. Well, so many questions come to mind from Dennis's contribution to the Wilsons' marital harmony. First, how differently husbands and wives view their roles in their marriage. Secondly, how differently we rank the importance of those various roles in the household. Third, how long it takes for husbands and wives to get adjusted to each other. Expectations, rhythms, etc. Now, on that one, I do have some encouragement for you. I can tell you from experience, the first 50 are the hardest. In this passage that we're going to look at, Paul offers instructions for Christian households. He begins with one of his famous one another's: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now this verse is the foundation for all that follows. It shouldn't surprise us, this teaching that husbands and wives subordinate their own desires to that of their spouse. Case in point, I'm moving to Missouri because I love that woman. Well, this is consistent with the many one another's that seem to meet us everywhere in the New Testament. Have you ever spent any time just going through the one another? It's kind of fun, really. And I can only give you a sampling, but let's start with Jesus in Mark 9. Be at peace with one another. Jesus again in John 13. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And in John 13. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. And then in John 15, this is my commandment. Take it seriously. It's a commandment that you love one another, just as I have loved you. And then he repeats himself in John 15:17. This I command you, that you love one another. And then there are all those injunctions from the Apostle Paul. Here's Romans 12. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor. And then Romans 15. Therefore, accept one another, just as Christ also accepted us. Romans 16:16 has always been a bit of a problem for me. Greet one another with a holy kiss. I was in Poland, where the men take that verse literally. On the mouth. I have such compassion for you women now. You have to kiss us guys. Galatians 5:26. Let us not become boastful, challenging one another, envying one another. That's negative. Back to the positive. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. Ephesians 4, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ has also forgiven you. And then there's this tough one over in Philippians. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. There are so many more. You'd almost think that in the Christian life, nothing is more important than how we treat one another. Even at home, how we treat one another. Submit to one another, then, out of reverence for Christ. For as long as I've been conducting weddings, I've read Ephesians 5 as a part of the service. I don't start with verse 21, but I immediately go to verse 22, which I consider one of the absolute most important verses in the Bible. Wives, submit to your husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. I taught that verse to my wife very early in our marriage. While I was working down at Hope International University, one of our professors there, Cara Alley, delightful woman, described how she applies this verse. She says she practices submission. She practices selective submission. She believed in the necessity of a wife submitting to her husband, but she reserved for herself the right to select which of his wishes that she will submit to and which she won't. Which isn't, of course, submission at all. In an argument or a disagreement, If you give in on something that doesn't matter to you, that's not submission, that's indifference. Submission is when you give in on something that really matters to you, something you don't want to accept, but you do it anyway because of your love for the one who wants what you don't want. Did I mention I'm moving to Missouri? I have often enjoyed quoting this passage to Joy, my wife. I'm a preacher after all, and I was a seminary professor to boot, so she should take my word for it. This is what she should do. After all, she doesn't even have a degree from a Bible college, so she should accept my interpretation of the Scriptures, because I have a piece of paper that it puts on the wall that says, I know this. Now, unfortunately, that may all be true, but, sorry, but my wife has read the Scriptures all by herself, and she knows what's coming. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any blemish, but holy and blameless. Now, my wife thinks that sentence to the husband is just as important as the one to the wife. And my wife is right. The temptation for both the husband and the wife is to concentrate on the verses directed to the partner in the relationship. And we husbands even congratulate ourselves on doing whatever we are doing, demanding whatever we are demanding for our spouse's own good. Here are the words we hang on to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. Christ has done that for the church. Now, we husbands, we're really good at perfecting other people. We're at our best when we're perfecting our spouses. And this verse seems to justify us husbands. As I said, this is all for your own good, darling. We overlook the comparison, though. This verse is about what Christ did for the church, his bride. The language seems to be referring to baptism, the washing with water through the word. What it is not about is taking on ourselves the obligation, the right, the responsibility of making somebody else, anybody else, perfect. Instead, this is the challenge. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. The two have become one flesh, after all. After all, no one ever hated their own body. I have to take exception to that just a little bit, because I know some people who do hate their own bodies. Hence bulimia, anorexia, other eating disorders, smoking, drinking, drugs. But we do know what Paul means here. He means that we're not to put ourselves first. And since the two are now one, putting myself first means putting my wife first. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. In our lifetimes, we've seen this marriage ideal in America being shoved aside. Many young people, and some older people as well, question the need for getting married at all. It's much simpler, much easier to just live together for as long as it works, and then move out and probably into another relationship for as long as that one works, and then move out, and so it goes. So hard as it is to sustain a rewarding marriage, why do we even bother to get married? Now, there's several possible reasons. We marry for companionship, of course. We marry for sex, of course. We marry for comfort and security, for financial reasons, because we want to have children, and so on. But the truth is, few of us marry for love, at least as the Bible defines love. The biblical ideal in marriages is for the sake of our spouses, assisting them to realize the potential God gave them. It's no wonder then that so many marriages fail. If a man asks a woman to be his wife to serve his selfish desires, his selfishness traps them both. But if the man's goal is his wife's good, and the wife's goal is her husband's good, then there's hope for that relationship. I've been grousing about this move to Missouri. Now, I've been totally unfair, and I hope you know that I've been unfair. I'm married to a woman who has followed me around for 61 years. And you know what her goal has been for 61 years? To make me look good. Now, she didn't succeed, but that wasn't her fault. So you can bet your bottom dollar I want to do something for her. Now, when I was on the other part, you weren't amening back there. Well, you catch on, don't you? The view of Christian marriage obviously demands a high view of women. It wasn't always so. Demosthenes, in the 4th century before Christ, expressed the prevailing view of his day when he said, "We have courtesans for our pleasure, prostitutes for our daily physical use, and wives to bring up legitimate children and to be faithful stewards in household matters." Jewish rabbis in the 2nd century after Christ taught a Jewish man to thank God that God did not make him a Gentile, a woman, or a boor. In Shakespeare's England, it was the custom for a man of means to keep a wife to run his house and a mistress to satisfy his physical needs. That arrangement wasn't limited to Shakespeare's England. Throughout history, men have viewed women as a means to satisfy the man's desires. They certainly considered women, if not inferior to men, then certainly subordinate to men. And against them all stands Paul with his Lord. The apostle's ideal of marriage is the highest to be found anywhere. He treats a woman as worthy of God's love, and hence worthy of a man's love and of a man's sacrifice. It's helpful for us to remember that in Paul's day, marriages basically were arranged. A man and a woman didn't fall in love and then get married. They got married and then learned to love one another. Only in recent generations have we defined marital love as something we fall into. Until then, marital love was something we were expected to grow up into. Not that this teaching is easy to apply. Here before the preacher stands the blushing bride, the handsome groom, standing full of emotion, full of hope, full of anticipation. The minister takes them through their vows. They promise each other to be faithful and loyal, hang on to each other. And the minister blesses them and he sends them away on their honeymoon, and generally they have a pretty good idea, but then they come back from the honeymoon to face reality. And that's when the power struggle begins. Who's going to be the leader in this home? Who's going to give in when the disagreement turns serious? And on what principle? This is the scene into which Paul speaks when he says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then having laid that groundwork, he moves on to the children. Paul sees the same principle at work here in our relationships with our kids. Mutual submission is called for. Parent-child relationships, too, can often be difficult. Comedian Phyllis Diller speaks for a lot of us when she confesses, the reason I'm not an alcoholic is because I don't like to drink in front of the children. And when I'm away from them, who needs it? Well, the challenge of children obviously is not new. I found this complaint in my reading. I can't attest to the authenticity of it, but it sounds authentic. Our youth today love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority, disrespect for older people. Children nowadays are tyrants. They contradict their parents, they gobble their food, and they tyrannize their teachers. That quotation is over 2,500 years old, handed down from the 5th century BC, if my source is correct. There's always been tension between parents and children. But Paul has already dealt with the overarching principle, submitting to one another, acting on behalf of, in the best interest of the other. And this is what he's really saying to the children. Children, this is verse 6, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on earth. I love the simplicity of this appeal. Why should you obey your parents? He says, because it's the right thing to do. Period. It's spelled out in the 10 Commandments. Paul is just quoting right here. And you can't improve on it. It's the right thing to do. For your relationships with your parents, for their sake, for your sake, if you want to enjoy a long life. Think that one through. I was here just this weekend listening to somebody talking about her parents and the damage done that she's had to deal with in one way or another for a lifetime. She represents a lot of us. So Paul is here tracing the implications of this whole letter's theme of unity in Christ. Unity that is achieved through submitting to and honoring one another. His point is that as self-assertiveness can destroy the unity between a husband and wife, so it can separate parents from their children. His words are correctives. If you follow his advice, there really can be peace in your home. And I'm saying this to you as a father who was a pretty strict father and who really did expect obedience from my children. And for the most part, I got it, but not totally, and not always willingly. And sometimes I won at too high a price. And sometimes I lost, and they paid the price. I can't read these words without thinking of a little ritual in my own home when I was growing up. I was a teenager. Like most teenagers, I was sleep deprived. Facing the morning wasn't my favorite thing to do. And when it was time for breakfast, my mother would call me. And my mother would call me. And my mother would call me. And my dad called me and I got up. I love Paul's wording here. Obey your parents in the Lord. Now, we all know parents who are unworthy of trust as parents, who ignore or betray their children's best interests, whose orders shouldn't be obeyed and whose example shouldn't be followed. What about them? So the appeal then must be to a higher authority. That's where the in the Lord comes in. Like most parents, Joy and I had to deal with some rebelliousness on the part of our own kids on their way toward maturation. And at one point with a couple of them, I realized that my days of automatic authority in their lives was over. So I wrote them a letter acknowledging that, admitting that I knew my days were over as the ultimate authority in their lives. And then I recommended a better authority. I recommended Jesus. If you take the cues for your behavior from Jesus, you'll be okay. And I'll be at peace with that. We're dealing here with an Old Testament word repeated in the New Testament: honor your father and mother. Now that's even stronger than obey. Treat them with respect. Give them the deference due to those worthy of tribute. As you outwardly obey their desires, inwardly nurture the attitude that keeps you at peace with them. Now, Ogden Nash, it's true, Ogden Nash wrote, children aren't happy with nothing to ignore, and that's what parents were created for. But that is a joke. Long life. Rebellious and disobedient children fight all their adult lives against the guilt they incur when they reject their parents' authority. If they were reared in a home fraught with disharmony, when they were growing up under an unworthy parent, they carry a psychic burden that can shorten and certainly sadden their mature years. The truth is, we all have to come to grips with this. You must honor your father and mother, if for no other reason than to protect your own mental health. The time comes when you have to forgive your parents. I remember that time. I remember when I was young and I knew everything my parents ought to do. And then I became a parent and realized they were giving it their best. And I had no right to ask for anything more. Honor them to the extent that you can honor them. Husbands and wives, relate to, that is, submit to one another in the Lord. Slaves, be obedient to their masters as they would obey Christ. All Christians are to be strong in the Lord. This passage makes it very clear. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. Now, if you were writing this today, he would say fathers and mothers. It was assumed in his day that the father was the final word. In our time, parents are in partnership more. Fathers, this is from Colossians, do not embitter your children. Do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. That word discouraged. They will lose heart. They'll give up. What a huge assignment it is for us parents. Remember your own growing up years? They were not easy, were they? How much it mattered to know your parents were for you. I already told you I was a middle-aged man when my father died. And I grieved then, I kind of still grieve now, because I lost my chief cheerleader. Oh, he would discipline me. Oh, he would take me into the cooler and talk to me. My dad was a grocer. In those days, we had walk-in coolers for the meat, for the dairy products. He would take me back there to give me the father-son talking to, because we would get to the point real fast, because it was cold in there. Yes, he did all of that. But I always knew he was cheering for me. He was giving me heart. That's our task. So our parents hugged us, laughed with us, cried with us, disciplined us, didn't let us off the hook when we were wrong, but they didn't cast us out either. To this day, you can tell I give thanks for my parents. They were my cheering squad. They gave me heart. And one of the things I'm looking forward to in moving back to Missouri, I got a passel of grandkids and great-grandkids there. I want to find some way to give them heart. I learned to appreciate what they had done for me, by the way, after I became a youth minister and a high school teacher. It was when I was immersing myself in the company of young people that I caught on to something. And that's what I caught onto was this, that children will obey their parents as a generality. Now, there may be exceptions, but children will obey their parents to the extent they believe that their parents are acting on their best behalf. It's not about, they're not acting because of what the neighbors will think or how it'll make the parents look, but they're acting in love on behalf of the child. And when the kid knows that, it affects his whole outlook on life. Well, we've come to the end of Paul's household instructions, except for what he has to say about slaves and masters. Now, at first blush, this passage seems to have nothing to do with modern families, since we don't have slaves, we don't have household slaves, we aren't masters. But many of us are employers and supervisors, and most of us are employees, and we feel at times like slaves. Paul hasn't left his theme here either. It's still all about submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. You can't get around this theme. As hard as it is for us to accept and as hard as it is for us to put it into practice, this is the word of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord. Now that's pretty clear, isn't it? And so is this. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. The principle holds. Treat one another with respect, with kindness, with tenderheartedness, with grace, forgiving one another as Christ has forgiven you. Young Dennis may have been able to walk away from the quarreling Wilsons because he didn't want to get involved. But we can't. We can't walk away from the lessons and the tensions at home, from the stresses with the children, with the demands of bosses and the needs of our subordinates. In fact, we have no alternative but to apply Paul's principle. We will submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. We will do what Jesus did.